12 ships limped into Messina harbor in October 1347, and everyone aboard was dying. The Genoese sailors had black swellings the size of apples erupting from their necks and groins. They bled from their mouths. Their fingers and toes had turned black with rot. Some were already dead, slumped over oars or sprawled across decks. The harbor master took one look at the nightmare approaching his docks and ordered the ships to leave immediately. They did, but the order came too late by hours, perhaps only minutes. Rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes onto the docks, carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Within days, people in Messina began dying with the same horrifying symptoms. Within weeks, the city was a charnel house. Within months, Italy was burning its dead in mass graves. Within a year, half of Europe would be dying, and nothing anyone did would stop it. This is the story of how 12 merchant ships returning from a trade voyage became the most lethal vessels in human history, killing somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people, erasing up to 60% of Europe's population, and transforming Western civilization so completely that nothing would ever be the same again. The plague that arrived in Messina that October had traveled halfway across the world to reach Europe. Its journey began in Central Asia, possibly in the steppes north of China, where Yersinia pestis lived naturally in populations of wild rodents. The bacterium had probably existed there for millennia without causing human catastrophe, maintained in a stable cycle between fleas and their rodent hosts. Something changed in the early 14th century. Possibly climate disruption, possibly ecological disturbance from Mongol military campaigns, possibly random mutation made the plague suddenly more virulent or more capable of jumping to humans. Whatever the trigger, by the 1330s, the plague was killing people across China and Central Asia. Chinese records describe cities where the dead outnumbered the living, where corpses filled the streets faster than survivors could remove them, where entire regions became silent graveyards. The Mongol Empire, which stretched from Korea to the Black Sea, provided perfect conditions for disease transmission. The Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting east and west, became a highway for death. In 1346, the plague reached Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula. The city was under siege by a Mongol army commanded by Johnny Beg when plague broke out in the Mongol camp. Soldiers began dying in droves. The siege should have collapsed as the Mongol army disintegrated, but Johnny Beg ordered one final act before retreating. His soldiers loaded plague corpses onto catapults and hurled them over Kaffa's walls. This may be history's first documented use of biological warfare, though historians debate whether it was strategically intentional or simply vengeful disposal of infectious dead. Either way, plague entered Kaffa. The Genoese merchants inside the city watched the Mongols retreat, thinking they had survived. Then people began dying. The Genoese did what merchants do. They fled. They loaded their ships with whatever goods they could salvage and sailed west, racing ahead of the plague they didn't yet understand they were carrying. Some ships headed to Constantinople. Others sailed for various Mediterranean ports. 12 made for Messina, gateway to Italy and the heart of European commerce. They carried silk, spices, and death. The harbor master's decision to expel the plague ships from Messina was rational but futile. Medieval understanding of disease was primitive and wrong. The prevailing medical theory held that illness spread through miasma, bad air caused by rotting organic matter or astrological misalignment. Quarantine existed as a concept, but no one understood that rats and fleas were the actual transmission mechanism. By the time the dying sailors were visible evidence of plague, thousands of infected fleas had already dispersed into Messina's rat population. The ship's departure accomplished nothing except spreading the plague to other ports where they sought refuge. Sicily's fate was sealed the moment those ships docked. The symptoms that appeared in Messina within days of the ship's arrival were horrifying and unmistakable. Victims developed fever, chills, and extreme weakness. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, or groin that could grow as large as apples and turn black as they filled with blood and pus. The buboes were agonizingly painful. Many victims went mad from the pain and fever, running through streets screaming before collapsing. Some buboes burst, releasing foul-smelling discharge. Victims bled from their noses and mouths. Their fingers and toes turned black with gangrene as blood vessels failed. The disease typically killed within 3 to 5 days of symptom onset, though some died within hours. There was no treatment. Medieval medicine could offer nothing except bloodletting and prayer, both useless. Doctors who tried to help generally died themselves within days. Families watched helplessly as loved ones suffered through agony and death. Messina's response combined panic, denial, and futile attempts at control. Authorities ordered the sick isolated and their houses marked. They banned public gatherings and closed markets. They burned the possessions of the dead. Nothing worked. The plague moved through families, then neighborhoods, then the entire city. The death toll mounted so quickly that normal burial became impossible. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls and filled with hundreds of corpses daily. Even these became insufficient, as gravediggers died faster than they could be replaced. Bodies piled in streets and homes, rotting in the Mediterranean heat. Survivors fled the city, carrying the plague with them to other Sicilian towns. By December 1347, Sicily was dying, and the plague was crossing the strait to mainland Italy. The speed of the plague spread across Italy was apocalyptic. It reached the mainland in late 1347 and swept northward like fire through dry grass. By January 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice, Italy's great port cities and commercial hubs. These cities had extensive trade networks throughout Europe, making them perfect amplification points for disease transmission. Ships leaving Italian ports carried the plague to Spain, France, and North Africa. Overland trade routes carried it north through the Alpine passes into Germany. By spring 1348, the plague was killing people in virtually every Italian city. Florence lost perhaps 60,000 people, more than half its population. Venice lost 60% of its people. Rome, though less densely populated, still suffered catastrophic mortality. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, described streets empty except for corpse bearers, houses abandoned with doors standing open, entire neighborhoods silent. His work, The Decameron, opens with one of history's most vivid eyewitness accounts of plague devastation. France received the plague in spring 1348 through multiple entry points. Ships from Italy brought it to Mediterranean ports. Overland travelers carried it across the Alps. The disease reached Paris by June 1348 and killed with stunning efficiency. Paris may have lost 50,000 people, perhaps half its population, in a matter of months. The city's graveyards overflowed. Mass graves were opened, filled, and opened again. The Cimetière des Innocents, Paris's main cemetery, reportedly received so many bodies that its soil level rose several feet. Queen Jeanne of Navarre died of plague in 1349. King Philip VI survived, but watched his court disintegrate as nobles and officials died around him. The French countryside suffered worse than cities in some regions. Villages were completely abandoned when everyone died or fled. Agricultural production collapsed as peasants either died or abandoned fields. Famine followed plague, creating cascading catastrophe. In Avignon, seat of the papacy since the schism with Rome, Pope Clement VI faced the plague's arrival with more rationality than most leaders. He consulted his physician, Guy de Chauliac, who correctly identified that the disease spread from person to person and recommended isolation. Clement sequestered himself in his palace, allowing no visitors. He followed an unusual preventive measure suggested by his doctors, sitting between two large fires that burned continuously. The theory was that heat would drive away the miasma. This was medically nonsensical, but it worked accidentally because the heat likely killed fleas and deterred rats. Clement survived while thousands died in Avignon around him. He issued papal bulls allowing plague victims to confess sins to each other when no priest survived, a radical theological accommodation to catastrophic priest mortality. He also condemned the persecution of Jews, though his decree was widely ignored. England received the plague in June 1348 when ships from Gascony docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From that single port, the plague spread inland along trade routes and rivers. It reached London by September 1348 and killed perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 people in the capital over the next year. King Edward III survived but lost his daughter, Princess Joan, who died of plague in September 1348 while traveling to Spain for her wedding. The English countryside was devastated. Manor records show entire villages dying or being abandoned. In some regions, 40 to 70% of clergy died, creating a theological and administrative crisis. Monasteries were nearly wiped out in some cases because the monks' communal living and care for the sick exposed them maximally to infection. The Archbishop of Canterbury died of plague in August 1348. His replacement died in May 1349. The third appointed archbishop also died of plague before he could be consecrated. The plague's march through Germany and Scandinavia in 1349 demonstrated that no geography provided safety. The disease traveled up the Rhine, across the Baltic, into regions that had seemed remote enough to escape. Hamburg lost perhaps half its population. Bremen suffered similar devastation. In Scandinavia, the plague arrived by ship and killed with the same efficiency it had shown in southern Europe. Norway may have lost 60% of its population. Sweden suffered catastrophic mortality. Even Iceland, one of Europe's most isolated settlements, received the plague through trade ships and lost perhaps a third of its people. By late 1349, the first great wave of plague had touched virtually every corner of Europe from Sicily to Scandinavia, from Portugal to Poland. The medical response to plague was a catalogue of failure based on fundamental misunderstanding of disease. Doctors believed in humoral theory, the idea that health required balance between four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Plague was thought to result from humoral imbalance caused by miasma. Treatments focused on restoring balance through bloodletting, purging with laxatives, and induced vomiting. These interventions weakened patients and probably hastened death. Doctors also applied poultices to buboes, lanced them to drain pus, or burned them with hot irons. None of this helped. Some physicians prescribed bizarre remedies: drinking vinegar, eating arsenic, sitting in sewers to drive away bad air with worse air. Rich patients could afford theriac, a supposed universal antidote containing dozens of ingredients including viper flesh. It was useless. The only medical advice that actually helped was the recommendation to flee infected areas quickly and stay away until the plague passed, summarized in the medieval phrase, "Cito longe tarde," leave quickly, go far, return slowly. This saved individuals but spread the disease geographically. Religious responses to the plague ranged from rational to insane. The Church taught that plague was divine punishment for human sin, which led to various attempts at collective penance. Processions wound through cities with participants praying and singing hymns, inadvertently spreading infection through crowds. The most extreme religious response was the flagellant movement. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, wandered from town to town whipping themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal spikes. They believed that their suffering would appease God's wrath and end the plague. They marched in organized formations, stripped to the waist, beating themselves until blood ran. They sang hymns between lashing sessions. The flagellants attracted followers desperate for any solution to the plague's horror. Initially, the Church tolerated them as expressions of piety, but the movement quickly became uncontrollable. Flagellants claimed their suffering was more valuable than church sacraments. They attacked clergy who questioned them. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in 1349, but it continued in some regions until secular authorities violently suppressed it. The search for scapegoats led to one of the plague's darkest consequences: the massacre of Jews across Europe. Rumors spread that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells and springs. This was impossible nonsense, as Jews died of plague at similar rates to Christians, but the accusation provided an outlet for fear and long-standing anti-Semitism. In 1348 and 1349, Jewish communities across Germany, France, Spain, and Switzerland were attacked. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349, after the city council, under pressure from guilds and mobs, accused them of well poisoning. In Mainz, the Jewish community fought back against attackers and killed 200 Christians before being overwhelmed. The entire Jewish population was then slaughtered. Basel burned its Jews. Freiburg expelled theirs. Erfurt's Jewish community was annihilated. Pope Clement VI issued bulls condemning the persecution and pointing out that Jews were dying of plague too, which proved they couldn't be causing it. His intervention had minimal effect. The pogroms continued until Jewish communities in many German cities had been destroyed completely. Some Jews fled east to Poland, where King Casimir III offered protection. The demographic and cultural impact on European Jewry was enormous and lasting. The plague's progression was not uniform or predictable. It struck different regions with varying intensity. Some cities lost 70% of their population, others lost 30%. Rural areas sometimes suffered worse than cities, sometimes better. The variation remains not fully explained. Population density mattered, but other factors also influenced mortality. Weather, rat populations, flea species, human behaviors, possibly genetic differences in susceptibility. The plague moved in waves, appearing suddenly, killing for weeks or months, then disappearing, only to return months or years later. Some regions experienced multiple waves between 1347 and 1353. Each wave killed fewer people than the previous because the most vulnerable had already died and survivors had developed some immunity. But the psychological impact of repeated outbreaks was devastating. People lived in constant terror of the plague's return. The economic consequences of losing 30 to 60% of Europe's population were immediate and revolutionary. The labor shortage was catastrophic for the existing feudal system. Before the plague, Europe had a labor surplus. Peasants were tied to land through serfdom and had little bargaining power. Lords could extract labor services and rents because peasants had no alternatives. After the plague, surviving peasants suddenly had immense leverage. There weren't enough workers to farm the land or staff the workshops. Lords desperate to get crops planted offered wages, better conditions, and freedom from servitude to attract laborers. Peasants could move to cities or other estates seeking better terms. Those who stayed demanded payment in coin rather than labor services. The rigid feudal hierarchy began dissolving as market forces overwhelmed traditional obligations. England's Statute of Laborers, passed in 1349, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent worker mobility. It failed. Peasants ignored it, and enforcement was impossible when labor was so scarce. Similar legislation in France and elsewhere proved equally futile. The plague had inadvertently created conditions for peasants to negotiate from strength for the first time in centuries. The social transformation extended beyond economics. Pre-plague European society was rigidly stratified with limited mobility. After the plague, social barriers weakened. Merchant families bought land from impoverished nobles. Skilled artisans demanded guild membership previously restricted to hereditary members. Women entered trades previously closed to them because men weren't available. The church, desperate to replace dead clergy, lowered educational requirements and accepted candidates previously considered unsuitable. This influx of less educated clergy contributed to criticism of church corruption that would eventually fuel the Reformation. In cities, guilds that had controlled access to trades found themselves negotiating with outsiders. The social order, based on fixed hierarchy and hereditary status, began giving way to a more fluid system where capability and wealth mattered more than birth. This transformation wasn't immediate or complete. but the plague accelerated changes that would characterize the late medieval and early modern periods. The psychological and cultural impact of the plague manifested in art, literature, and philosophy. Pre-plague European art focused on idealized religious scenes, courtly life, and natural beauty. Post-plague art became obsessed with death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a popular artistic theme showing skeletons leading people from all social classes in a dance to the grave, emphasizing that death comes for everyone regardless of rank. Transient tombs, showing decomposing corpses rather than idealized effigies, became fashionable among nobility. Paintings and frescoes depicted plague saints and protective figures. Literature shifted toward darker themes. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, frames its stories as entertainment for wealthy Florentines hiding from death outside their walls. The work's tone shifts between bawdy humor and dark pessimism, reflecting the plague's psychological impact. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written decades after the plague, still shows its influence in themes of mortality and social upheaval. Philosophy and theology struggled with the problem of evil. If God was benevolent and omnipotent, why did he allow the plague to kill the innocent alongside the guilty? The failure of prayer to stop plague deaths shook faith and contributed to growing criticism of church authority. The church emerged from the plague weakened in authority and credibility. Priests had died in enormous numbers, either from ministering to plague victims or from living in close quarters in monasteries. Their deaths were particularly visible and shook popular faith. If priests, who supposedly had special divine protection, died at high rates, what did that say about their spiritual status? The church's explanations for the plague were unsatisfying. Claiming it was divine punishment for sin didn't explain why children died, or why prayers went unanswered, or why the devout died at similar rates to the sinful. The replacement of dead clergy with poorly educated substitutes led to visible decline in pastoral quality. The church's failure to protect its flock while demanding tithes and donations created resentment. Some historians argue that the plague planted seeds for the Protestant Reformation that would erupt 150 years later. The questioning of church authority, the criticism of clergy, and the skepticism about institutional religion all intensified after the plague experience. The long-term demographic impact extended beyond the immediate death toll. Europe's population in 1340 is estimated at 75 to 80 million. By 1400, after multiple plague waves and associated famines, it had fallen to perhaps 50 million. The population didn't recover to pre-plague levels until the 16th century, nearly 200 years later. This prolonged population depression had complex effects. Agricultural land became abundant and cheap. Forest reclaimed abandoned farmland. Villages disappeared. In England, depopulation enabled the enclosure movement as landowners converted crop fields to sheep pasture, requiring far fewer workers. The shift to pastoral agriculture accelerated rural depopulation. In Eastern Europe, lords responded to labor shortage differently than in the West, imposing harsher serfdom restrictions and tying peasants more tightly to land. The divergence between Western European development toward market economies and Eastern European entrenchment of serfdom partly traces to different responses to post-plague labor shortage. The genetic legacy of the Black Death remains detectable in European populations today. Scientists have identified that a specific genetic mutation, CCR5 delta 32, which provides some resistance to plague, increased in frequency in European populations after 1347. Individuals with this mutation have a non-functional CCR5 receptor, which Yersinia pestis may use to enter cells. People with 2 copies of the mutation show resistance to some diseases including HIV, which also uses CCR5 receptors. The mutation's increased frequency in European populations compared to African or Asian populations suggests it was selected for during the Black Death. This means the plague literally changed European genetics. The descendants of plague survivors carry genetic markers of their ancestors' survival. a biological memorial to 14th century catastrophe. The question of whether the Black Death was truly bubonic plague remained debated until recently. Historical descriptions match bubonic plague's symptoms, but some skeptics argued the medieval disease spread too quickly and killed too efficiently to be Yersinia pestis based on modern plague behavior. DNA analysis settled the debate. Genetic material extracted from teeth of plague victims buried in London and other European cities confirms that Yersinia pestis was the causative pathogen. The medieval strain was closely related to modern plague but had genetic differences that might explain its virulence. The Black Death strain appears to have been unusually lethal, possibly representing a particularly aggressive variant that subsequently evolved toward lower virulence. Highly lethal diseases face evolutionary pressure to become less deadly because killing hosts too quickly limits transmission opportunity. The Black Death may represent a moment when Yersinia pestis crossed into human populations in a particularly deadly form that subsequently attenuated. The plague's impact on the Renaissance and European development remains debated by historians, but appears significant. The Renaissance emerged first in Italian city-states in the late 14th and 15th centuries, partially enabled by conditions the plague created. Labor shortage made labor valuable, generating wealth for workers and artisans. Concentration of wealth in fewer hands created a class with disposable income to patronize arts. Questioning of traditional authorities, including the church, created intellectual space for humanist philosophy. The demographic collapse freed resources previously devoted to subsistence, allowing investment in education, arts, and exploration. Some historians argue that the Renaissance would have happened anyway, that it resulted from rediscovery of classical texts and trade with Byzantine Empire. Others contend the plague accelerated changes that made Renaissance possible. The truth likely involves multiple factors, but the coincidence of timing between the Black Death and Renaissance flowering suggests connection. The contrast between pre-plague and post-plague Europe illuminates the magnitude of transformation. Before 1347, European society was characterized by rigid feudalism, overwhelming church authority, limited social mobility, and Malthusian population pressure. After 1353, European society was characterized by weakening feudalism, questioned church authority, increasing social fluidity, and abundant resources per capita. The change wasn't instantaneous or complete, but the trajectory shifted. The Europe that discovered the Americas, launched the Reformation, and developed modern capitalism was post-plague Europe. The catastrophe of 1347 to 1353 was not the sole cause of these developments, but it was a catalyst that accelerated changes already incipient and made others possible that might not have occurred otherwise. The psychological legacy of living through the Black Death shaped a generation and their descendants. Survivors watched the majority of people they knew die in agony. They buried parents, children, siblings, friends. They lived with constant terror of symptoms appearing. They saw every institution they trusted fail to protect them. Government, church, medicine, all useless against the plague. The trauma affected behavior and attitudes. Some survivors became obsessed with pleasure, living intensely because death could come at any moment. Others became deeply religious, seeing survival as miraculous divine favor requiring piety. Some became depressed and withdrawn, unable to connect with others after losing so many. The art and literature of the late 14th century reflects this trauma in its darkness, its preoccupation with death, its questioning of meaning. Generations born after the plague inherited stories from survivors and were shaped by societies reorganized around plague's demographic and economic consequences. The question of why some people survived while others died remained mysterious to contemporaries and is still not fully answered. Genetic factors mattered, as the CCR5 delta 32 mutation demonstrates. Previous exposure to related diseases might have provided cross-immunity in some cases. Nutrition affected susceptibility, with well-fed individuals better able to survive. Some historians suggest vitamin D deficiency, Worse in Northern Europe with less sunlight may have increased mortality. The pneumonic form of plague, which spread through respiratory droplets rather than flea bites, was invariably fatal, while bubonic plague killed perhaps 60% of victims. Those who developed bubonic plague but avoided pneumonic complications had better survival chances. Pure chance mattered enormously. Where you lived, whether infected fleas bit you, whether your immune system mounted effective response. No amount of prayer or medical intervention influenced outcome, because neither addressed the actual bacterial infection. Modern antibiotics cure plague easily, but medieval Europeans could only hope their bodies would fight off infection naturally. The economic legacy of the Black Death's labor shortage persisted for generations. Real wages for workers rose dramatically in the century after plague and remained elevated until population recovered. This was Western Europe's late medieval golden age for working people, a period when craftsmen, farmers, and laborers enjoyed purchasing power and living standards that wouldn't be equaled again until the Industrial Revolution. The labor shortage also drove technological innovation as expensive labor incentivized labor-saving devices. Some historians argue that the path toward mechanization and ultimately industrialization began with the post-plague drive to do more with fewer workers. The printing press, developed in the 1450s, partly responded to expensive scribal labor. Agricultural innovations reducing labor needs emerged throughout the 15th century. The incentive structure created by post-plague labor shortage encouraged the technological creativity that would characterize early modern Europe. Subsequent plague outbreaks continued periodically for centuries, but never matched the Black Death's mortality. The plague returned to Europe in waves roughly every decade through the 17th century. London's Great Plague of 1665 killed perhaps 100,000 people. Marseille's plague outbreak in 1720 killed 100,000. But these were local disasters, not continental catastrophes like 1347 to 1353. Several factors explain the difference. European cities gradually improved sanitation and public health measures. Building techniques evolved to reduce rat infestation. Quarantine procedures became more effective. Most importantly, subsequent exposure meant European populations had some genetic and immunological adaptation. The survivors of 1347 to 1353 and their descendants carried genetic variants that provided resistance, and immune systems had learned to fight Yersinia pestis more effectively. The plague never again killed with the efficiency it displayed in its first European appearance. The comparison to COVID-19 is inevitable and instructive. Both were diseases spread partly by trade and travel. Both arrived as novel pathogens attacking populations with no prior exposure. Both provoked responses combining rational public health measures with ineffective or counterproductive interventions. Both saw scapegoating of minorities and spread of conspiracy theories. The crucial differences illustrate medical progress. COVID-19 killed perhaps 0.1% of global population, despite being a serious pandemic. The Black Death killed 30 to 60% of European population. Modern medicine provided vaccines, treatments, and public health interventions that limited mortality. Medieval Europeans had none of these, and COVID-19 also spread globally within months via air travel, whereas the Black Death took years to traverse Europe by ship and road. The emotional and economic disruption of COVID-19, which felt catastrophic to those experiencing it, was trivial compared to the Black Death. Half the people you knew didn't die. Society didn't collapse. The economic system didn't fundamentally reorganize. Drawing parallels helps understand past responses to disease, but the scale difference remains enormous. The 12 ships that entered Messina Harbor in October 1347 were not remarkable vessels. They were standard Genoese trading galleys, merchant ships that had been plying Mediterranean routes for decades. They carried standard cargo, spices from the east, silk, possibly grain. The sailors aboard were ordinary men pursuing ordinary livelihoods, merchants and mariners whose names are mostly lost to history. What made these ships historically significant was the invisible cargo they carried in the fur of rats and the guts of fleas. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had evolved its lethal mechanisms over millennia and now, through accident of circumstance and trade routes, was about to encounter a completely naive human population. The ship's arrival transformed them from commercial vessels into apocalypse machines. They delivered death so efficiently that within 6 years, half of Europe would be gone. The harbor master who ordered those ships to leave Messina Harbor made the only decision he could given medieval understanding. He saw dying men and knew something terrible was aboard those ships. His expulsion order was logical and useless. The plague was already spreading through Messina before he issued the command. The rats were already off the ships. The fleas were already searching for new hosts. The first Messinese citizens were already infected and would start showing symptoms within days. Nothing he could have done would have stopped what followed. If he had burned the ships at sea with everyone aboard, it might have delayed the plague's Italian arrival by weeks or months. But other infected ships from other Black Sea ports were already sailing toward other European harbors. The plague was coming to Europe, and medieval Europe had no capacity to stop it. The world that existed before October 1347 died with the plague's arrival. The Europe that emerged from the catastrophe of 1347 to 1353 was recognizably the same geographically, but fundamentally different socially, economically, and psychologically. The certainties that had structured medieval life dissolved in mass graves across the continent. The confidence in religious and secular authorities shattered. The economic system reorganized around new demographic realities. The psychological comfort of stable social order evaporated. In its place came a society more questioning, more mobile, more focused on individual advancement, more willing to challenge tradition. The transformation wasn't immediate or conscious, but it was irreversible. The Europe of 1400 was not the Europe of 1340, and the difference was carved by plague. 200 million people died, perhaps more. The number is so large it becomes abstract, impossible to truly comprehend. Each death was an individual tragedy, someone's child, parent, spouse, friend. Each victim experienced the terror of symptoms appearing, the agony of buboes swelling, the desperation of breathing failure in pneumonic cases. Each family watched helplessly as loved ones suffered and died. Multiply that individual tragedy by 200 million, and the arithmetic of horror becomes incomprehensible. The Black Death was not an abstraction. It was personal apocalypse experienced by hundreds of millions of people across 6 years. Those who survived carried trauma and grief that shaped the rest of their lives. The societies built by survivors and their descendants still bear marks of that transformation. The 12 ships entered the harbor. The rats left the ships. The fleas found new hosts. People began dying. And half of Europe followed them into mass graves dug in panic across a continent transformed by microscopic bacteria that had traveled from Central Asian steppes to Mediterranean ports in the guts of insects too small to see. That's what happened in 1347. That's what the Black Death was. Not divine punishment, not astrological misalignment, not miasma, but Yersinia pestis, arriving at the worst possible moment in human populations, completely vulnerable to its effects, spreading with efficiency that still stuns historians, killing with speed that still horrifies. The plague that killed half of Europe began with 12 ships in a harbor, and nothing was ever the same again.